Hello everyone, welcome to the system programming video lecture series, and in today's session we are going to cover Unix Linux architecture based on its parts, kernel and shell. So let's start with the parts of the Unix Linux operating system. The most important part is kernel, and sometime technically we can say that kernel is itself an operating system. Why? Because kernel is the main component or main part that allows the softwares to communicate with the operating system. So if we will not have the kernel, we will not be able to use the computing device, we will not be able to communicate with the hardware components of the computing device. Along with this main feature or main capability, kernel also used to handle memory. It used to handle the input output requests, as well as it used to perform program scheduling. Kernel is very complex, although we are covering basic details about the kernel, but in the other course like in operating system you will cover more details about the kernel. The next part is the shell and graphical user interface. By default in Unix or Linux based basic operating systems, they used to communicate by using the command line interface. They don't use to have graphical user interface like we have in Windows or MacBook. In Linux, if we have to use the graphical user interface, then we have to install external application, and by that way we can get some of the graphical user interface features with that applications. There are some distributions available based on the Linux Unix which provides built-in graphical user interface application, but here we are talking about the basic versions of the Unix operating system, which are mainly managed by the command line interface. Next is built-in system utilities. By default, when we used to install an operating system in the computing device, some applications used to get installed by them along with the operating systems, and those applications are like calculator, timer, disk manager. We used to have like virtual keyboard. We used to have some browsers, some task manager and other applications, and these applications are being added as part of the operating system to enhance the capabilities of the operating system. But if we want to install some additional features, for that case we need to have application softwares and utilities built by the third party, and those softwares we can install by our own manually, and then we can use those softwares as we need it. So those are actually external softwares, and there are thousands of softwares are available which can be used by the Linux or Unix operating systems, and those software, most of them are freely available. There are some paid commercial softwares also. Next slide is about Unix Linux architecture based on the kernel. In Unix or Linux operating system, programs always reside in memory. Whenever we have to execute or run any application, we need to move their data files or code files to the main memory, and then the application will work. Actually, this data movement used to be done automatically by the kernel. Kernel also used to have direct access to the hardware. In computing device, we used to have different hardware components internally or externally. Like internally we used to have memory, we used to have main hard drive or main storage, we used to have CPUs, we used to have GPUs, we used to have other type of memories, and kernel used to have direct access of those. In the same way, we used to have some external hardware components also, so kernel used to have access of those hardware devices. Kernel also handles file I/O. Kernel used to handle the file input output operations also, and it used to manage them also. In the same way, computing devices are now so powerful that they can do billions of instructions per second, and if we are running multiple processes, in order to manage them we need some sort of mechanism, and that used to be defined by the kernel, and kernel used to manage the processes running on the operating systems in order to distribute, schedule, distribute memory, and which process will run first, which will run second, and so on. All these things will be managed by the kernel. Only one copy shared by all users. As we know, in Linux, Unix based operating systems, multiple users can use the computing device at the same time, and if there are multiple users using the device, then they all will be sharing the same kernel. That's the main point. Next slide is about Unix Linux architecture based on the shell. As we know that shell is one of the most important part of the Linux, because we don't have graphical user interface in Linux, so everything used to be handled by using the shell command, and the communication between the user and the computing device used to be done by the shell. So a program or command invoked only when the user is logged in, because whenever user have to interact with the computing device, he must need to logged in, and then he will be able to invoke the command. Accept user inputs, examines and rebuild the command line. The shell used to take inputs from the users, it used to examine, check the errors and other things, and then it used to rebuild the commands that used to be sent to the kernel and so on. Make calls to the kernel for all other functions. So shell used to call the kernel to do the different actions based on the user commands. At least one shell is invoked by every user. Whenever a user have to interact with the device, he must need to open a kernel, and over there he need to write down the commands in order to interact. So at least one shell need to be opened in order to interact. User has a choice of shells. User can run multiple shells at the same time, and he can use as he want on his own choice. That's it for this session, and if you like the video, please click on the like button and subscribe my channel, and if you want to receive more videos, click on the bell icon. Thank you so much for watching the video.